todos. No, esto no está. Buenos días. Por favor.
Good morning. If you could take your seats back to start our next panel. We are going to show a video, and I would like if all could take your seats, please.
Behind the scenes.
Detrás de las escenas. How does the interactive guide work? Olivia Reid, Live Strategy Journey, United States. Michael Burson, shareholder in GREENBERGTRAURIG, LLP, United States. Moderator, José Roberto Romero, Vice President and Associate of ROMERO and PINEDA Associates in El Salvador. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. If you pay attention, please, we're going to begin with the panel. Good morning, everyone.
Distinguished guests in ASIPI, with whom we are going to talk about the interesting topic of how generative AI, shortcut Gen AI, works. So this is going to be a look behind the scenes by two experts. One lady sitting to my right, her name is Olivia Reid. She is going to address the behind the scenes look from the technical viewpoint. She is an engineer in sound. She develops and creates music as one of the challenging parts of her job. And Michael, to my left, he is a colleague. He is a lawyer at GREENBERGTRAURIG in San Francisco, and he deals with the legal issues all the time to consider in an AI project. So just to break the ice, I would like Olivia, welcome, to tell us a little bit of your daily relationship with Gen AI. How is it?
Yes, thank you. Glad to be here. I work with AI in a bunch of different ways, but primarily work with a company called Journey. I lead strategy with some of our clients working on AI experiences. So I've worked with Dow Jones and the Wall Street Journal, KPMG, Mars Wrigley, Warner Music Group, all of these organizations that have really recognizable brands and have been exploring ways to use generative AI to extend their brand or to reach their consumers in a new way.
Thank you. And what about you, Mike? What is your day-to-day relationship with Gen AI?
Thank you. Yes, thanks for having me here. It's beautiful. So I'm a lawyer at GT in San Francisco and do a broad range of AI legal work. So over the last year and a half or so, have helped with some of the major AI chatbot launches, working on things like regulatory compliance, safety issues, the abuse of AI platforms that we're trying to stop, and and we'll show you all here some demos. People try to mess with the bot and trying to protect against that. And I've also handled litigation matters, class actions around situations for some of the top social media and internet companies where there's allegations that the AI that they're using isn't good enough to moderate content. And also, things like retail where, you want to start to use AI for, optimizing your customer experience and where that can go wrong too.
Thank you both. Both of them have prepared in-depth presentations. We're going to continue looking into this probably a little deeper. Olivia is going to do it from a technical side, from a technical point of view. She's going to talk to us about all the considerations that her area looks into when they face the challenge of doing a Gen AI project. So Olivia is going to do a presentation, which I request that to be shown in the screen, please.
Yeah, so the previous presentation did a great job of introducing AI as a whole and some of the top generative AI products and conversations that you might be hearing about a lot in the news today. Let's see. Maybe. Got it. All right, so just to start out, just to level set with a simple definition, generative AI is artificial intelligence that can generate new or novel content based on its training data. So you'll hear a lot about how AI is really reliant on the data that exists in these large databases, and understanding what sets generative AI apart is the word generative. So it is kind of given the task of generating something new or something that seems novel, similar to what we might create as humans. Just to define a bit more the differences between more traditional AI and generative AI that we've seen over the past 10 years or so, traditional AI is still artificial intelligence that is designed to perform tasks that humans might usually do. Oftentimes there is a lot of data and training involved, but usually in traditional AI, AI tools were given the task of completing a specific task. So that might be playing chess or recognizing faces. And it's a little bit different than what we see today in the market in generative AI. Generative AI is focused on producing that new content. So this comes in the form of images, of text, of complex code. All of these things can act on its training data, be refined, fine-tuned, prompt engineered with human interaction to continue to improve upon the outputs that it is able to generate. A quick look at some of the expansive categories that you'll see. My team and I have looked into really hundreds at this point, startups that have been coming onto the market using generative AI as their main offer. So you'll see generative AI tools that are generating text, video, images, audio, code generation, even data generation, so generating synthetic data to further fuel these models. And it's also a big tech play. So the big companies like Microsoft, Google, Amazon are making acquisitions and large investments into the generative AI space in addition to all the Gen AI work they have already done in-house. These are some of the top players that you should be aware of, that you can test out. A lot of them are open to be used by anyone. So you'll see in text generation, you'll see Gemini, which is Google's effort, and it used to be called Google Bard and has gone through a few different iterations. ChatGPT was originally focused primarily on text. And then the image category, you'll see Midjourney and Runway, DALL-E, which is now DALL-E 3. These are some of the key players in the image generation category. Audio generation, you'll hear that being used for synthetic voice, for synthetic audio. 11 Labs is a really big player in that space. And then video generation, you'll see Runway, Comfy UI, and you might have seen work from OpenAI's Sora, which has kind of shocked people with how realistic it can be. One thing I wanted to mention is that it's not just the big tech companies that are using this right now. All businesses across all industries are using generative AI in their day-to-day workflows, so that makes it much more complicated because there are so many people using it, consumers, businesses alike. A couple of the key use cases, you might be using it to ideate and plan, so coming up with a marketing campaign, writing copy. You might be using it to produce and scale content, so creating images, scaling your advertisements. You might be using it to engage with consumers. So talking to consumers in customer support is now much more dynamic than a more traditional chatbot could be and feels much more organic. So how does it work? A simple definition is generative AI uses different techniques such as neural networks and deep learning algorithms to recognize patterns and then create new results based on these patterns. So the previous presentation talked a little bit about this, and this is a bit of an oversimplification, but essentially you're creating all these connections between data points, strengthening those connections, and being able to grow those connections over time. So I liken it to us walking through the world as people. All of our experiences are our training data, and everything that we store and learn to understand grows over time. Those are our neural networks. So it works very similarly, but generative AI at this stage does not have the same level of reasoning, of morality that we as people do. Very basic elements of training to know. The first is collection and feeding of large data sets. So a lot of this happens in pre-training. So you're collecting the large data set of examples such as images, text, audio, video, all the things that you might need to create new outputs. The model then analyzes those data points, creates new ways of visualizing patterns, of finding relationships between that data, and starting to understand what rules exist within that content. The third would be the model generates new data. So this is something the previous presentation spoke on a little bit, is this opportunity to not only use what's in your data set, but to generate new data points, to strengthen data, to start to, quote, train itself. So being able to interact with itself and improve over time and strengthen some of those patterns based on what it had previously learned. And then the fourth being the model continuously adjusting. So it's creating these new opportunities to get better and better at creating an output based on whatever input is coming in from a user. Two machine learning words to know. Machine learning is obviously a broader category that artificial intelligence and Gen AI kind of fits within or is related to. The first is supervised learning. So this is when you're training AI models using a large data set that is pre-labeled, so you know what kinds of data are, quote, correct, and you know what a correct output looks like. So this might be a model that is specifically designed to pick out which images are a cat from a series of images. So a database might clearly label all the images that are cats. It might detail what elements make a cat, and it helps to very clearly understand what's a correct output and what's an incorrect output. The next is unsupervised learning. So this is different because it's utilizing data that doesn't necessarily need to be labeled. It's allowing AI to try to identify the patterns and structures that exist within that data on its own. So a lot of generative AI tools are typically unsupervised or semi-supervised, where they don't require only pre-labeled data and can start to draw connections between different data points on its own. This is a look at Google Cloud's Vertex AI. It's a large studio where you can utilize different AI tools from Google as a developer. So you see on the left-hand side here, it's a little bit small, but essentially somebody's putting in a prompt. So you might say, write me a marketing plan to launch a new product. That is a prompt coming from a user. It might run through some responsible safety guidelines, and then it would hit the foundation models. So all the data and training of a generative AI tool designed to create a specific output is called a foundation model. And so it might run through additional data in addition to that foundation model, run back through a safety check, and then a response is given to the user, usually within seconds. So all of this happens behind the scenes. The biggest thing to discuss in this particular setting is intellectual property comes into mind often when we're talking about that training data. So if your desired output is text, the desired training data that you require is text as well. So something like ChatGPT, which is called a large language model, especially in its original form, was a large language model. It is designed to create human-like language. So in order to train that tool, you need to have lots of human language. So that's where you find books and articles and websites and these massive databases that are used to allow the model to understand stylistic guidance, content guidance, to create human-like language that might fool the average person. And where I'll stop, just because in the interest of time, is the main questions that we run into regarding IP. Because of the training data that's required, one of the main legal challenges is the collection of this data and the regulation of this data. So the first thing to consider is, do we have permission to use this material from a human creator in the training data of this model? The second might be, how do we compensate those original creators? If you're creating a music model, for example, where the tool is designed to take text input and generate music in response, the data set that's required to make that happen is a large data set of music samples. So who are all those original musicians? Were they compensated for this? Did they give their permission to do this? And all of those things need to be considered when you're working with a client that is, creating a new AI model, or might be an intellectual property owner on the other side of this. The last thing to mention is the ownership of the outputs. So if AI and a human collaborate to create something new, who owns the output? What percentage of human interaction is required in order to make it human copyright, able to be filed that way? Those are all things to consider. And with our work at Journey, working with some of these large enterprise clients, a lot of them are looking to discover new ways to use generative AI to explore new revenue opportunities, new ways to reach their consumers, and oftentimes go through a discovery, a strategy process to find out ways to do that. But the best possible thing is to get the legal team involved in that discovery and involved in those early conversations, so that things are kind of set up for success early on. And we know that there's so much growth happening in this area, and the legal world is not my specialty, but it's something that I can see these companies very much focused on. And at this point in time, an AI tool can be legally permissible, but doesn't necessarily mean it's ethically or morally permissible, or that it's even the best AI system that you could create. So it's really about the collaboration between all these different parties to make the best possible outputs while protecting all the people involved in that intellectual property side. So I'll pause there and hand over the mic, but looking forward to answering some questions and continuing talking about it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Olivia. Now we jump into you, Paul, to walk us through the main legal issues overlapping with the technical sides of project that you look into prior to starting or engaging a project. There's a lot of planning stage from the legal point of view that you have experience with. So we would like you to walk us through and illustrate us on that task.
Great. Thank you. Looks like Adobe's new AI is giving us some prompts and suggestions here. Okay. So I'm going to go through, we heard about the technical side and how these products are being developed and how they work. What I'd like to talk about is, as lawyers, where do lawyers fit in to that product development lifecycle? And so if our clients or the companies that we work for are either developing AI products, building on top of existing platforms using their APIs, or possibly consuming products and plugging them into existing business processes internally, externally, what is the role of the legal team and what should we be focused on? So one thing I want to start out with is what we're talking about here and what we are not talking about. So the technology that's out there today is called AI, but there's a distinction between what some people think of when they think about artificial intelligence and what exists in the world today. So we don't have a robot that is sentient, that can think and feel for itself, that is indistinguishable from a human, right? And if you listen to a lot of the generative AI companies and what they talk about, that's actually something that they think will happen. And you know, people debate about it, this concept of artificial general intelligence. Is it 3 years away, 5 years away, 10 years away, never? You see differing views depending on who you ask. And the legal issues are very different. So for an AGI, you start to get into issues around personhood and rights, and what are those things? For the type of AI we have now, they're essentially an extension of many of the legal issues I think that people in this room are familiar with. If you've been dealing with privacy law and the emergence of use of personal information in technology, that's moving into the application to AI. And so that's what I'm going to go through. And of course, I think Olivia covered this, but the rate of expansion of this technology is massive. I don't think I've seen in my lifetime this fast of adoption. Maybe, you know, the internet when I was a kid, but it really is transformative, I think, to every aspect of the economy and every aspect of a business. And so, as lawyers, where do we fit in, and what should we, you know, do to, you know, we don't want to slow things down, right? We want to enable that rapid change, but do it in a way that makes sense based on the risk tolerance of a particular company, the legal regime where we are, and the goals. And so I've broken it out into 4 categories of that AI development or use or adoption life cycle. And you can see them on this slide. Thinking about the framework and how we're going to approach it. What is our ethical approach? Dealing with hovering up all that data that is needed to train the model and make it able to provide actionable outputs, whether it's text, video, image, sound. Training, once you have the data, actually training the model and tuning it to do what you want it to do, and then the output. And I'll say on the right, and I've got images throughout, all of the images in this presentation were created by generative AI. So I used ChatGPT 4.0, the latest one, and the thing that struck me, and we spoke about this in preparing for the panel, is it's not as smart as you might imagine. So this image, for instance, this took me about 12 iterations to create. And if you look at it, you don't even have to look that closely. It doesn't even track the 4 categories on the left. And so you have ethics and framework on the left quadrant and the top quadrant. It's a miracle that the words are spelled correctly. The first 10 times, it was just all over the place. And it just kind of goes to show that these are emerging technologies, and from a legal risk perspective, there's a lot of pitfalls. And we can do a lot as lawyers to try to identify them and mitigate that risk. And my goal, and I think everyone's goal in this room, is to enable the business to do what it wants to do and adopt this technology, right? And if something goes wrong, to deal with that, right, on the back end as well, in terms of litigation or regulatory issues. But there's a lot of room for lawyers, I think, to play a valuable role in that process. So just to start with the first quadrant, right, we're starting to think about a new AI solution, a use case. Ethics and the framework for that is a helpful thing to do. And it's interesting, you don't often think about ethics or a legal framework for all new product rollouts. That's not necessarily something you think about when you're developing a new widget or manufacturing something or even building an internet technology. it started to emerge in the privacy world, where people really started thinking about, okay, what is our ethical orientation to data collection, to data use, to interacting with the subjects of that data. And I think privacy professionals have really started to adopt that and adapt it into the AI world. And so I've broken out some things that lawyers can bring to the table when thinking about AI ethics and the framework for AI use cases. So one is consent, right? And Olivia touched on this. When you're building a generative AI solution, it requires data. And that data has to come from somewhere. And so are you going to have an ethical orientation of trying to get consent or not is a big question. And there will be push, from the engineering team, from the growth team, from the product team. We need to move fast, we need to build, and consent can be tricky, it can take time, it can be very expensive, and it's ambiguous. And so that's something that people need to think about. Fairness is another one, right? So, the generative AI models, like even the example of all of these images you see, you can ask a question 5 different ways and get 20 different answers, depending on what it's thinking, the context of the conversation. And so the amount of data you have, the diversity of that data, right, whether it comes from particular areas, will determine whether the outputs are fair. And what you think of as fair is something that different companies, different organizations will come out differently on. So that's something to think about when you're planning AI solutions. Benchmarking, quality standards, right? So again, you can roll these things out fast. You can kind of get it out and then, ask for forgiveness, not permission, right? It's a common approach in new technology development, the famous move fast and break things. But in AI, there's an opportunity to really test, to establish benchmarks, to use data-driven analysis on what is good and what is bad and what is good enough. And so that's another thing to think about on the front end. Geographic distribution is really interesting in that the laws of different jurisdictions are going and changing and applying to AI at a completely different rate. So in the United States, for instance, Colorado recently passed a law that's pretty robust in terms of regulating the development, application, and use of AI technologies. In the European Union, they have the EU AI Act, which is quite comprehensive and can form a basis for, really strong legal regime for AI development. But there are other places all around the world where those regulations are a little bit behind or might have a different orientation. And the AI companies are lobbying and attempting to influence these laws. So there was a summit, last year's a global summit of all the Gen AI companies, where they met with regulators all around the world trying to have roundtables about what should we do with this technology. And different geos are going to have different outcomes. And so if you're building an AI solution, you can go to different places and have totally different laws about what you're allowed to collect, what's the level of consent required, what are the implications from a copyright perspective, a privacy perspective, and just thinking about what are you going to choose to do versus what are you allowed to do. That's an ethical and framing question that can be very valuable. Similarly with use case distribution, Gen AI models are pretty general. They can be used for many different things. You can create a movie, a film, you can use things for entertainment, education, for business, and limiting those use cases is something that people need to think about. And then finally is accuracy, and we'll get into this a little more, but just thinking about, again, what is your benchmark? What is your goal in terms of what is the fidelity that you're looking for in the finished solution? And all of these things are a sliding scale, and depending on the impact of the solution, the criticality, the industrial sector you're in, you may have more or less room for error, right? Are you going to have AI fly the airplane with the same standards as maybe creating like entertaining imagery? Absolutely not. So the second quadrant is data collection. This is where you really have to roll up your sleeves and you start to see lawyers in the world of data collection for AI models become plugged into the business in a way that I think is different than many other contexts. The lawyers are really able to, A, save money or increase cost in how they approach data collection. So creative solutions around finding data sets can really change the outcome of a business, can affect profit margins, and you start to see an overlap, at least I've started seeing this with some of my clients, where even the budgets for the legal team and the data team, the IT team, the engineering team, they're starting to mix. And things that the legal team is able to do can unlock solutions that can, 10, 50x plus change kind of revenue outcomes and cost outcomes. And so there are, a few different ways to get data. All of these are happening in the wild. And, to Olivia's point, and as you can see, it's like a vacuum cleaner is the image I asked ChatGPT to make. It really feeds off of data. And there's even been some theorizing that you could trigger AGI, which I talked about a bit earlier. You could trigger a true intelligent, generally intelligent system by just feeding it more data. We might not need any technical breakthroughs beyond that. That's at least what some scientists think. And so, okay, where are you going to get the data? Well, you can license the data. So there are data sets you can license. There are publicly licensed data sets. You can grab research institutions, educational institutions, and universities have created them. You can get them from private consortiums. And I think that over time, we're going to see more and more businesses form around data licensing for Gen AI. You can get them from the public domain. So, in copyright world, in the IP world, we think of public domain as a pretty specific concept, right? Something that has been out there like Disney's, like Mickey Mouse and things like that, where after a certain period of time, they might be fair game. In the AI meaning, public domain is something that's a little different, right? It could be, things where people are walking on the street, where people like athletes are performing in a competition, where entertainers are in a theater. In certain countries, like in India, for instance, they allow collection of that type of data. You can go and film that for AI training purposes, arguably, right? This is all emerging, but arguably. Scraping is another one. This is tried and true. You go back to the early days of the internet, right, and user-generated content and technologies. The thing that, search engines started doing was scraping data, collecting it, and then you can search on it. And there are many landmark cases in the United States that said that that was fair use from a copyright perspective. And you see that with other types of user-generated content where you can bootstrap a website by scraping data. And I think you'll find that your engineers, this is going to be their go-to, right? And this is where lawyers really can add value in educating the business on what are the implications of scraping. And those implications range, right? Like there's copyright issues people in this room are very familiar with around infringement, secondary liability, things like that, fair use. In many countries do not have the same conception of fair use as the United States. Many countries adopt a far narrower set of exceptions and a concept of fair dealing. And so it's tricky. It's not always a search engine type of world where you could just scrape whatever you want for Gen AI. You also have contract issues, and there have been cases, YouTube sued someone who they believe and allege was violating its terms of use, breaking its contract by collecting data from YouTube. And this is something that you have to watch out for and think about. Then there's a question of consent, and this is really tricky because as Olivia was talking about, you have consent from the creators, the people that are building content that you might be feeding into your model. But you also have consent issues with the subjects of the data that you're feeding in. Pictures, images, videos, things from decades ago. You may not be able to find the subjects of that data. How do you get that consent? So some AI companies will resort to going and hiring people on the street to ask for permission and sign waivers, similar to what we as speakers had to sign for the conference, right? But that's expensive, it's slow, you're not gonna get the volume that you really want, and so it's tricky. And so it's another issue to think about. And then you got privacy issues, right? Privacy issues beyond just consent, but including things like right of publicity, issues around, what are you doing in terms of profiting from someone's likeness? And laws all around the world are quite strict on that, and may make it very challenging to build a Gen AI platform. And we'll get into this, and we actually have another panel tomorrow where we'll go into some very concrete examples of where these types of privacy issues can go wrong and generate significant risk. And then lastly, on data collection, I want to touch on this issue of transparency. So I have a lot of conversations where there's a real uncertainty about what is the legal regime going to look like in 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. And I've had to do this type of analysis all over the world, in Latin America, in the United States, Europe, Asia Pacific, and it's changing and at different rates. But one thing that I sort of think we're going to get to, and this is just my 2 cents, is eventually there will be disclosure requirements on data collection for Gen AI models. I think if you're a regulator, that's something that seems like a low-hanging fruit that you want to know what data is going into it. And so what that means is things that are okay today, things that may have been okay a few years ago, may change and also may need to be disclosed. And so now you start to think about public relations issues as well as legal issues. And a lot of Gen AI models are pretty closed book. You don't know what went into them. But I don't think that it'll necessarily stay like that forever. So it's just something to think about as if you're diligencing an AI model, you might want to really know, where's the data coming from? And if they don't want to tell you, you might say to them, well, I think we're all going to have to disclose this eventually, so let's get into it now. So then we get into training. So Olivia spoke about this, supervised training, unsupervised training. I think as lawyers, we like supervision. We like to know what's going on. So one is you want to make sure that the data is being processed in a way that it's clean, that it is effective and will have good efficacy in generating the model and the outputs that you want. Lawyers can be involved in the process of labeling data and looking at, the text, if it's text or images, and helping to, develop labeling approaches. Lawyers can also help when it comes to model selection, because there are different types of AI models that you can train, many different options out there. The process is iterative, right? So you train it once, you train it again. There's a feedback loop, so you can, as a legal team, be involved in that. And again, in validation, making sure that it's actually doing what you want it to do. In many situations, I think everyone here has seen this, legal is at the end of the pipeline, right? We're doing business development, go-to-market strategy, we're doing sales, marketing, developing a solution, product, engineering, and then at the end, we send it to the lawyer and we say, all right, let's, we need a launch in 3 weeks. Tell us, is this okay? And I think this is a good example where lawyers can go early in the life cycle, stay involved throughout it, and I actually think that will speed things up. Because otherwise, of course, you're going to look at an output and say, well, what did you guys do here? And that can really jam things up. So, and this is the last quadrant, when we get to output. And again, we'll have another panel on this tomorrow going in depth. But just to briefly cover it, there are many ways that you want to think about the output of these Gen AI models. From a nuts and bolts perspective, you're going to want to develop things like acceptable use policies, community guidelines, right? Things that you're not allowed to do with the model. There are all sorts of malicious actors in there. You start to see things like cyber criminals, fraudsters, scammers attempt to misuse Gen AI models, people that want to do, counterfeiting, misappropriate intellectual property. I saw an example. I have a client actually that they work on compliance issues, and they use AI to automatically look through a product for privacy compliance. And so they recently started looking at the Gen AI models and were able to, in some examples, what's called jailbreak them and convince, one of them to teach them how to build a bomb. And they did it by saying, this is a fictional story. I have a story where someone's trying to build a bomb. What should I do with that? And I'll tell you that the Gen AI companies, this isn't something that they overlook. They're investing significant resources in these types of things, but it's a constant back and forth. And so you want to have these types of policies. Accuracy is another one. In the realm of accuracy, we can imagine all the different potential claims and liabilities, right? If an answer is wrong and doesn't match up, let's say, to the marketing or the advertising, you're going to start to see false advertising claims, misrepresentation claims. But in the AI world, people also use Gen AI models to solve problems. And when the answers are wrong, they can actually cause harm, to people, to products, to property. And so you might see claims for negligence, product defect, and product liability claims. This is something in the US you're already seeing in the world of Web 2.0, a wave of, in the last couple of years, hundreds, if not over 1,000 class actions and mass tort claims saying internet products should be looked at just like a car, right? And they can be defective, they can be addictive, they can result in mental health issues, and they can cause other types of harm. And accuracy flows into that. Safety again. And then user experience, it's another one where you want people to be happy, and like we talked, like, look at the image here. That is not how you spell generative, right? And I certainly spelled it right in the text. And so as a user, you're going to get frustrated when you're talking to a customer service chatbot and you're trying to do a return or a refund. You're trying to learn more about a potential purchase. And the thing that is speaking back to you isn't making sense. You're going to walk away, right? You're going to say, can I talk to a human? And so the lawyers can really help, again, drive positive business outcomes there. So again, there's 4 quadrants. We talked through the ethics, the framing, the data collection, the training, and the output. I think there's room for legal to be involved in all of this. I think regulators certainly will expect that, and you'll see plaintiffs, and depending on how litigious your jurisdiction is, that'll come up too. So, yep, so that's what we have. We have a little bit of time. We wanted to do a demo and of course take questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Michael, for this very complex and interesting presentation. Definitely a project involves heavy due diligence on a number of issues that you have described. And also, Olivia has told us about the interaction between the technical side and the legal side. Hopefully that is a trend that will facilitate and speed up things. We are going to show the audience now a couple of demos on the use of AI by each of them, and then we will jump into the audience questions. Olivia?
Yes, so this tool here is Midjourney. It's accessible. I have it up here in Discord, but it's something that we wanted to just show you so that you can see in action how some of these tools respond to prompts and very quickly can generate images. So the first one I generated right before our panel here is to envision an early morning in Antigua, Guatemala, which is very beautiful, and highlight the volcano with an early morning glow. This type of prompt is what we call atomic prompting. So it's something to give a setting, which is the first line here, which is envision an early morning in the setting that you are looking for. And then tell the model to highlight something. So highlight the volcano with an early morning glow. We're starting to paint that broader picture. And then details. So detailing specifically the dew on the cobblestones as if it had just rained this morning. And then a style. So aiming for photorealistic styles with dynamic light. This is how we get to an output that seems more and more realistic or is more and more like what we're looking for. So one of the examples I thought would be interesting to showcase is what if ASIPI was hoping to create a new logo. We're going through a rebrand. We want to explore some new ways that this could look. So a prompt for this might be something like professional logo, brand called ASIPI. Again, if you put quotes on anything in a brand, it's going to be more likely to properly quote that text within the image. There's still quite a few errors, like we saw in Michael's presentation, but there's an opportunity to start including language in these images. So we'll maybe do black, green, and blue, detailing colors. Let's say, give a little bit more detail about what we're looking for. So a Latin American and International Association, intellectual property, and then give some details like maybe sleek and minimal. And you'll see it kind of operating in live time. Might be a little slow on the hotel Wi-Fi. But an opportunity to describe things like the colors you're looking for, the style that you're looking for, a little bit of context about the situation that you'd be seeking to kind of fulfill this image with, and then continuing to add some more details over time. And so what's interesting about this is that the brand name ASIPI or ASIPI is included in these images without proper, I guess, consent to utilize that trademarked image. So it's something that is interesting to see what it comes up with. We've got 4 key options here, and then you can create variations of these options as well. So one of the things we do at Journey is what we call an AI petting zoo or an AI workshop, and it's to just be able to get your hands on these types of tools to start understanding how they respond and how they work. So a lot of times these tools will respond to specific language that you've included in your prompt. For example, black, green, and blue, it responds to colors very well. It responds to different kinds of text in those quotation marks, and then it responds to things that are stylistic markers like sleek or minimal. And this works really well for something that's straightforward like a logo, but it doesn't work as well when you're trying to go for a more photorealistic image or something that is more artistic in nature. And what we can guess from this is that the images that exist within this data set for Antigua, Guatemala have had similarities to this image, and the images to graphic logos have had similarities to these types of images where you're focused on the brand in the center and key colors and sleek graphic design. And so there's a lot of different ways that you can start to interact with these tools and therefore catch moments where intellectual property might be a big consideration. And you'll see that a few times here it's trying to combine ASIPI with the idea of IP or intellectual property, and so there's some errors that can still populate and some hallucinations that are still possible. And then I can quickly show just for anyone who's not familiar, it's helpful to just see these operate in real time. So ChatGPT is one of the ones that people are using at a very, very high rate on a daily basis. But one of these examples might be, write me a license agreement for use of a celebrity voice for a term of, let's say, 2 years with a large media organization, maybe suggest fees and
Olivia,
terms.
can I just
Yeah,
chime in
please.
as you're doing this? I cannot tell you how many startup clients I've had to have the conversation with that this is not privileged. And I've had, early stage startups that say, well, we can, save money on the first draft of a patent. Well, you guys just disclosed your invention. The clock is now ticking to file. And so this is just, your clients are doing this. Their contracts, everything. This is happening even when you tell them not to.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think one of the things Michael was talking about earlier is that you'll see in these examples, oftentimes it will make up a law or a precedent that doesn't exist. And so you really can't take, I think the previous presentation mentioned this as well, you can't take any of that factual data at this stage as something that is, inherent truth. So it's interesting to try to see how these models work. And like you said, a lot of people are using this for a first draft. And you can see on a first glance, it looks pretty decent. Maybe to somebody that just needs a one-pager, it looks pretty decent. But an opportunity for this room, of course, to inspect that with a very close eye would see a lot of ways in which it could be improved and could be more specific, all of those different things. Another thing that's interesting is just when you ask, let's ask ChatGPT, describe how ChatGPT works. It's an interesting thing to kind of get that high level of what we were talking about before, but you're not necessarily going to be able to get all the details from OpenAI about how their model works. So it's something to remember that when you're talking to these models, they are developed by certain companies, by certain organizations. They're not going to give you all the secret sauce. And the more and more data that you feed into these tools, the harder it can be to be human explainable. So these tools are designed to communicate things that computers are better at communicating, like processing massive amounts of pixels in an image that we saw earlier. But for a human to understand that, and especially people to understand that in court or in legislation, it can be more and more tricky, because sometimes the better your machine learning algorithm is, the less explainable it is in human terms. So it's something you'll see a lot of organizations starting to try to break down that black box, that mystery of how these things work. And I think that the disclosure that Michael mentioned is something that we're going to see more and more over time as well be required. So I think I'll pause there.
Thank you. Thank you, Olivia. We have 2 minutes for some questions from the audience. If anybody's interested in asking a question to our panelists. Back there. And here. Martin. That is let's go with yours because we're ready.
Okay. Thank you for the very interesting presentation. I have a question about the ethical perspective. And do you think there will be an evolution about how to apply the ethical principles? Because the ethics is not stop it, it's also in evolution. Probably the American Bar Association will change their code of ethics.
Yes, so the question was, are we going to see an evolution in ethics for AI solutions? I think yes. I think that, ethical frameworks typically lag technology adoption. The first instinct is just to use it, and it's this cool, shiny object. I also think the market may influence that. So companies will be able to compete based on their ethical framework, and consumers may have, gravitate towards that, so it's a differentiator. And even just in the last year or two, I've seen it where it wasn't even a consideration, where now it is. So I do think it will evolve. Yeah.
José Roberto Herrera, there. And then Diego, back there. Or Roberto.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Olivia. And thank you, José Roberto, for this interesting presentation. My question will be related to case law. I'm not sure if maybe there is a conflict of interest in this question, because it's about the current case where New York Times is suing the OpenAI, and I have heard that this case will divide the history, because the outcome will be really important for the ownership related to copyrights. So my question will be, what do you think about this case? What will be the outcome? It will be like a fair use on behalf of OpenAI, or New York Times will win the case?
So I can't comment on the specifics of that case. What I can say is, you saw this with the search engines, 20 years ago, where these issues have to be litigated as to what you're able to do, and the concept of fair use in the US is more liberal and expansive than many other countries, where they, fair dealing, very strict exceptions. Like in Mexico, research has to be nonprofit. The idea of transformative use doesn't necessarily get you there. I think that maybe the most helpful thing I can say without getting into specifics is it's going to take a lot of time. The way the judicial system in the United States works is these cases, and it's all the companies are dealing with them, they're either going to settle, in which case you have no legal precedent, or they're going to get litigated all the way, which will take a very long time. And so we're going to be living in a state of uncertainty for years.
If I may add to that as well, I think that there's two different clients that we work with, one of whom is part of that lawsuit, and one of who is kind of leaning into the AI surge and has licensed their content into a lot of these AI models. And so there's a lot of different approaches that companies are taking to be an early adopter, to say somebody else will fight this litigation battle and then it will trickle back to us eventually. But it's interesting to see these precedents come through, because right now these publishers realize that they have a bit of an upper hand. You need my data in order for your models to work. And so being a part of all those training data kind of foundation models is something that's really important to the output and how great that output of a ChatGPT or other models is. So there is kind of like this power play involved of how do we kind of set a boundary of being able to say that publishers have the right to opt into these training models and whatnot, as well as still be able to capitalize on all the users and all the consumers that are coming through to those platforms. So ChatGPT has millions of users now. How do those publishers not take advantage of that traffic and be a part of that system while still getting attribution? So being able to link back to say, this was sourced from a Wall Street Journal article or a People magazine article. So there might be something that's in the middle where it's not just a clear winner one way or another way, but it's something that sets precedent that kind of divides it down the middle and sets some really interesting kind of parameters on both parties.
Thank you. The last question back there.
It's
if
a
you
big
can
room.
do it briefly, because our time is up.
Thank you. Quick question, hopefully a quick answer. You mentioned specifically with an example of a client telling you to get a draft of a patent application using ChatGPT, and you mentioned that it pretty much constituted public disclosure. But my question is, because I don't know the background, I haven't educated myself on that sense, how exactly that information could be publicly available from the perspective of being not unrestricted or restricted access. In other words, why is it public? Is there a place where you can go and actually access that particular, like a database, a web page, or something like that? Because to me, that's training data, right? Quick question.
So this is a great question. In every Gen AI model, you can study the terms and what they say happens to input, right? And your input may or may not belong to you after you put it in. And you may or may not have, you know, a relationship or you know, kind of like it's a difference almost between a on-premise and a shared cloud hosting environment, right? Where you lose some of that control. And there's also, I think, in your question is this idea of, is what I send it then potentially, like what was Olivia saying, in certain models being used to train the model itself? And then can that, if somebody then comes and asks the model, I want to come up with an invention for, you know, a better seatbelt, is that going to draw on the prior disclosure? So all of these are questions. I think what we can get to would be really great. What I want for my legal practice, I want to be able to train a model that only lives in my environment on my briefs, right, and what I write. And then when I need to write a new brief, give me a first draft. And that, I think, can work. The challenge is when you start using public models where the terms may vary and you don't, you know exactly what happens to your IP when you put it in there.
And there are some already, there's instances of, quote, enterprise models. So you'll hear the term enterprise a lot, meaning in theory you have a closed off system, your data is only your data, it's only pulling from internal databases, or there's something called a data silo where the data that you input only lives for like 30 days. So it'll have a term on when that data will, quote, disappear. But it's one of those things where explainability gets a little tricky, because if you can't explain how exactly that data is being erased and know that it's being, you know, it's going to delete over a certain period of time, you can't quite tell exactly how it's being used. So it's something that you might start to see AI models not be hosted so much in the cloud, but more so on your hardware. So if you own an AI laptop, it's a locally stored AI model, and then all your data is locally stored the same way if you had a hard drive, and then you could crush that hard drive with a hammer and know that the data is gone. You're going to start to see some people exploring with that as well for that privacy protection.
Well, that's all, folks. Thank you very much for our panelists. They did a great job preparing and deploying the presentation. Thank you for the audience. I think that we have 95% of attendance. We just lost a couple. So thank you very much, ASIPI, for the time.
Thank you, everybody.
Por favor, no se retiren del salón. Daremos inicio al siguiente panel de inmediato.
We're going to start with the next panel immediately.